Hi, this is my review of the Dawnline Feral States. This is an expansion for the Dawnline role-playing game. If you haven't seen my review of the core rulebook for the Dawnline, I recommend that you check out the link in the description below. So the Feral States is basically a composite expansion. You have fiction, you have a cruciary, which is basically a bestiary. You also have a creature generation system, and you have a set of adventures as well. These adventures can be tied into a larger campaign or integrated into an existing campaign, and there is even an adventure that can be split up to serve as a sort of subplot for your campaign. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. I have a couple of criticisms. This document does not have a cover. That is, at the time of this review, if you want the cover, you need to enlarge the thumbnail at DriveThruRPG and save it. So I think it would have been great if you had a full color cover integrated into the book so that it had more coherence. And my other criticism when it comes to quality could be considered a neutral point. It's basically that there are very few illustrations when it comes to the set of adventures included here. You do have illustrations for the maps, some small graphics, but perhaps a couple of illustrations would have been quite good to give you an idea of the different adventures, but I say that this is somewhat of a neutral point because this also means that there's a lot of content to each of these adventures. You have tips and advice on how to run them, how to integrate them into a campaign, how to use them as starting points, how to handle the conclusion of each adventure, because there are some books out there that you have an illustration taking half of the page or even an entire page, and you have scarce details about the adventure and not so many tips. But here with the Dawnline Feral States, the adventures are quite complete with all sorts of information that you do not always expect to see in a scenario or adventure. And those are my only criticisms. The writing is top-notch, as expected from Richard Kelly. If you haven't seen my reviews of other works by Richard Kelly, I also recommend that you check out the links in the description below. Everything is well organized and written. The font is very easy on the eyes. The graphic design is also in tune with the frontier, post-apocalypse, weird horror, sci-fi type of flavor that only the Dawnline can offer. The illustrations are in black and white and they look very nice. They are quite evocative of the grittiness, the weirdness, and the mysteries of the setting. You also have a complete and well-organized table of contents, and the entire document is fully bookmarked. So overall the quality is great, despite those couple of things that I mentioned at the beginning. Now let's talk about the contents. First, after a brief introduction, you immediately jump into the fiction. And I want to talk about the couple of short stories that are included in the Dawnline Feral States. My only criticism of them is that in one of them, there is somewhat of an unexpected time skip. You see this action scene unfolding and suddenly it cuts right to a more diplomatic type of scene, and I think the transition should have been a bit more smooth. But everything else is great when it comes to the fiction. And I won't be giving away any spoilers, but I do want to point out a few very flavorful things when it comes to representing the setting and the theme of the Dawnline. In these couple of short stories, you will see in no particular order how, for example, a human could take the decision of becoming a vampire. It is not an easy choice to make, and the short stories do not go too much into detail as to how this ritual of transformation from human to vampire could happen. It does involve a vampire and a human, of course, and a very traumatic experience, a period of adjustment. Mostly it deals with the psychological and emotional reasons as to why a human would go through such a transformation, such a metamorphosis. These short stories also have to do with how a lurk could result from a vampire that became too alienated from his human companions, how that vampire loses all empathy and becomes this sort of feral beast driven by its need to survive and to feed on human blood. But you can also see the other side of the process when a lurk is actually rescued from that state, and a sense of awareness, our conscience is once more awakened in that lurk. So these short stories do a great job at allowing you to see, to get a glimpse of that sort of process, what goes through the vampire's mind and through the minds of the humans that see this transformation or bring about this transformation as well. The stories also make great emphasis on how it's almost impossible for a community of humans to survive without vampires in the setting of the Dawnline. So overall, the stories do a great job. They give you a lot of ideas of how the game world proceeds, how adventures and campaigns could unfold and develop with the tragedies and triumphs of the vampires and their villages. Now let's talk about the expanded creaturey or bestiary. From now on, this review will contain spoilers, so keep that in mind. I'm just going to mention some of these creatures because there are a lot of them. This is a long list. It's divided by categories. First, on the automata category, we have the Egg of the Night. This is basically a steel ball, the size of a child, and it spends most of its time lying perfectly still. It's just there, lying in wait, until the scent of blood or a cry of pain or something indicating that someone is suffering from an injury happens. Then this ball quietly starts to move towards the wounded individual or being, and it then attempts to heal that creature. However, rarely do its patients survive the process, so it's somewhat of a crazy robot doctor of sorts. Then we have the Helios. This is somewhat like a cat beast statue of sorts. It's quite heavy and powerful, however it moves quite silently as well. So you never know when this thing is going to strike from some hidden place. And to make matters even worse, it has this roar of the dawn. This is basically a burning roar, as if someone is projecting this searing light towards you. Then we have the Colony Barge. This is basically an airborne horror of steel and chrome, a floating city of sorts that starts to fly around, and it begins a process of depopulation by killing everything in sight. Then we have the Idle Hands. As you can see, this is a monstrosity, an automata of multiple limbs that can deal death in several ways, and it's quite fast as well. You may end up finding the Idle Hands right next to you in a matter of seconds. On the Beast category, we have the Ambassador Wasp. These wasps can basically inject a control grub in the victim's spine. So now anyone who they inject this grub into, they become slaves or servitors of these wasps. So it's a very dangerous insect that can rapidly take control of an entire village. Then we have the Who Goes There. This disturbing creature reminds me a bit of Nemesis or one of those Resident Evil biohazard sort of creatures, because it's just this huge type of being with this sort of coat or robe around it. And when he opens this robe, he can swallow whole entire humans or vampires. The first process is slightly less painful and less disturbing. He basically just gulps down anyone. But there is this other process in which he integrates the victim into his body and only a semblance of the face remains. And these type of monsters look for vampires because vampires take a lot longer to digest and they get to savor that morsel. There's also the Wayfarer Dread Cluster. This is a grouping of Wayfarer cacti. You may remember that plants in the setting of the Dawnline are kind of like animals. They move around, sometimes as a pack or as herds. And in the case of this sort of cacti community, which is the Wayfarer Dread Cluster, it becomes thirsty for moisture, so it's somewhat like a vampire cactus of sorts that attacks its victims, draining them of their fluids. Then we have the Mostellaria. This is sort of like an aberrant turtle with a monstrous deformed maw, and it uses an entire city on its back to trick creatures into thinking that it's just another place, another site where they can get some refuge perhaps, or trade goods, but it's actually this monster waiting just below. On the Ephemera category, which is basically like ghosts, spirits and wraiths, we have the Mistralia Zephyrling. This is a sort of insane type of ephemera that when it discovers mortals, it flies into a rage, a shrieking rage, perhaps at the remainder of the flesh they have lost, and they start to rip the warm-blooded interloper to shreds. Then we have the Mistralia Wraithblood. Unlike their high-altitude cousins, Wraithbloods are found in sunken valleys, caverns, and in the depths of ruins. Despite their ability to fade into thin air when startled by their target's vampire guardians, Wraithbloods otherwise seem relatively solid. They obsessively stalk their prey until their victims or themselves are finally eradicated. Then we have the Red Court Phantom. This is a sort of braided figure that could be found inside a necropolis or some burial site, and it tethers itself to a mortal or vampire, and then it starts to control that victim's actions. We also have the Aberrant Nova. This is a very dangerous ephemera. It's a being of pure light, and as you can imagine, it's quite deadly for vampires. But even for mortals, they can destroy an entire village simply by approaching it. On the mortals category, we have the Chula Rider. This is basically a mortal that rides a spider. These spiders are quite violent, deadly, and obedient, but there is a small chance that they may actually devour their riders. So although these riders have that combination advantage of attacking from on top of the spider and attacking with the spider's poison and its speed, it's not a sure thing that they will survive the ride. But still, they will keep on riding. Then we have the Radiant Cavalier. These are featured heavily in the adventures in this book. The Radiant Cavalier is basically an organization of riders that use these sort of artifact steeds. They are fueled by curse, actually. Some of you may remember that the curse is a very real, very dangerous, and almost ever present in some areas, sort of miasma. But these steeds actually use that curse as sort of fuel. Each member of the Radiant Cavalier is highly skilled at fighting from on top of these curse-filled artifact steeds. They act as very territorial gangs. So if you get into trouble with the Radiant Cavalier, you'll have to face off against the entire group. Then we have the Priests of the Grasping Hand sect. This could actually leave mortals alone, but if they know that they are being guarded by vampires, they will attack those vampires. They are zealots, and they use their special attacks such as Blood Purging Fist, Litany of the Inner Void, so they look quite supernatural in the way they do things, and they will try to impose their tutelage and their doctrines and dogmas upon entire villages. Then we have the Sun-Touched Hierophant. This is a very interesting sort of individual. It's like the opposite of a Penumbrist that usually wields the shadow or the darkness. In the case of the Sun-Touched Hierophant, this is a sort of being that emanates light constantly. It emits these sunbursts, and because of that, it is extremely deadly to vampires. On the Sirens category, we have the Moon-Skinned Interloper. These sirens have elongated whip-like bodies made of thrashing tendrils, and they use corpses as their primary means of reproduction. Then we have the Cellarborn Clutchlings. These remind me a bit of the Facehuggers. So these are small type of sirens that they attach themselves to their victims and they start to inject poison. So they are very dangerous, especially in groups. On the vampires category, we have the Ghoul Leftover. Ghouls are not vampires. At least that's what the Caryatid tell us. They are not even lurks. Ghouls are beings that feed on flesh, and they still have a sense of awareness. The ghoul must periodically consume mortal flesh, or else it regresses into a leftover. Now, a leftover is a ghoul on cannibal autopilot. They are completely animalistic, so just like a vampire could turn into a lurk when the vampire becomes dominated by his most basic instincts, the ghoul turns into a leftover. There are also even more dangerous ghouls, such as the Ghoul Skin Shepherd. This sort of ghoul takes over an entire community. It acts as a sort of guardian, but it starts to charge for its services. So first, in exchange for their protection, they could take a bit of fat from the people that they are protecting, and then it escalates. Maybe later on they take a finger or two. But over time, they may end up demanding a sacrifice, an entire human being, in order to protect the village. So these are like the villains when compared to vampires that protect villagers for just a bit of blood. Then we have the Child of the Glass Coffin. This is a very ancient, very powerful vampire. Some of you may remember it from the adventure included in the core rulebook. So this sort of vampire, if it is released from this artifact sort of prison, it will attempt to destroy the world in order to remake it, regardless of the current state of the world. This vampire is also featured in one of the adventures included in this expansion. And there are many other creatures. For example, you have statistics and information on those vampires and mortals that were controlled by wasps. But this is just a small sample. I want to give you a taste of the things that you will find in this expansion that are neatly organized by category. After this section, we have the creature customization engine. This is all about designing creatures. This is a well-laid process, very easy to follow, to stat creatures, determine how difficult they will be in an encounter, assign attribute points to them, assigning skill points. You also have information how to assign power points, designing new abilities for the creature, or perhaps modifying or tweaking existing abilities. You also have information on how to review, test, and modify the creatures, and you even have an entire tutorial where you follow along a process on how to design a specific creature. So this is very handy if you have some questions or something is not very clear about the process. With this tutorial, you will have no trouble at all. At the end of the book, we have the scenario folio. These are scenarios that you can use as standalone experiences, but you can also link them together to create a campaign. It's also very easy to integrate them into an existing campaign. There's a lot of variety to what you can do in each scenario. Some of them are a bit more geared towards combat, some others are more focused on exploration, and a couple of them rely heavily on social interaction. So you have scenarios for almost any type of situation. Combat is prevalent in all of them, but you can see some details, some elements that are focused on some other aspects of adventuring. One of them can even be split apart so that you can have a subplot going in your campaign. So you can basically take this scenario and just cut different encounters and have them come up during key moments in your campaign that make sense. And there's also a scenario that also gives you a guideline or a framework to handle things in a secondary adventure hub. You could say that in the Dawnline you always have an adventure hub, which is your village, a place to rest and recover and obtain some information. But there is the Grand Bazaar, and this one is featured in one of these scenarios. So the Grand Bazaar could be used as a recurring site or a secondary adventure hub, like I said, so that the player characters can make some choices to obtain some profit, some prizes, some information within the Grand Bazaar. But you will have to choose going there instead of gaining an advancement when you are leveling up, so to speak. Or if you want to spend some time protecting the village, taking care of it, trying to gather some resources, you can go to the Grand Bazaar instead, and it could be a more profitable thing. But if you are unlucky, it could be a waste of time. Something that I really like of these scenarios is that from beginning to end, they give you so many ways, so many options on how to run them. They give you different hooks. They give you different ways in which the scenarios could end. The scenario could end in a very positive way or in a more negative note. But either way, you could also have some things, some situations in between good and bad, so that the player characters actually benefit from the scenario, or maybe they obtain some benefits at the great cost of some resources or some non-player characters, or even causing the death of some player characters. There's also a lot of information so that you can handle off-the-rails situations. If you have groups of player characters that are constantly pulling the rug from under your feet, coming up with all sorts of crazy ideas to handle things, taking alternative routes, it's very easy for you to handle those players, their choices, because of different encounters, the multiple options. It's very easy to take a set path and modify it according to the player character's choices. And don't worry about the map, even though the different scenarios are more suited to specific areas in the map in the core rulebook. You can easily place them in other parts, adapt them to the flora and fauna and geographical situation of those places. Let's talk about the first adventure, the Path of Thorns. This has to do with a pathway that is in the route of migrating cacti. You may remember that in the setting of the Dawnline, cacti are kind of like animals. They're constantly moving about and they move pretty fast. If you're not careful, they could actually impale you. If you are on their way, they will run into you and you could end up badly hurt or even dead. So it's all about navigating the village, the wagons, around this dangerous route. However, there are many dangers, with bandits and brigands and all sorts of things, natural hazards, also some beasts, some monsters. So it's all about the characters choosing a route, taking different paths according to their choices. They could also set up some ambushes. If the brigands get too close, the characters could prepare an ambush, get ready for them. So it's all about planning ahead and strategizing. This is a very strategic adventure, in fact, at least when compared to the others. There's a lot of action as well. You could also gain some resources along the way, some substance. You could find some things amidst the ruins, the different mysterious sites. But the player characters have to be careful what they are exploring, what they are investigating, because in the case, for example, of the funeral markers, they could get this sense of dread. They know that there are ephemera, evil spirits about, and you could get unnerved for the next combat encounter. So you will end up fighting brigands, ephemera. You'll have to find some way to overcome the cacti. Some of them can become quite violent. It all depends on your choices. You're always pressing forward, trying to find the way to get your village to safety, avoiding blight flies, overcoming all sorts of hazards, both natural and unnatural. After that, we have the Chaos at the Grand Bazaar scenario. This is a very flexible scenario, and it's probably the longest depending on how the player characters interact with the non-player characters within the bazaar and how they solve combat situations. This is basically, it could be the first time the characters visit the Grand Bazaar. You have an introduction to it, that is how you approach the Grand Bazaar. Could also have some positive or negative effects. You could run into some problems with sirens and brigands. Once you get to the bazaar, you could end up with a false sense of security. The bazaar is somewhat more diplomatic, a bit more peaceful when compared to other sites in the Dawnline, but this is no guarantee that your characters will make it out of there alive. All sorts of creatures, such as lurks, bloodwild, otherlings, they go into the bazaar and they have to follow the rules of the bazaar. They are not strict set of rules, just don't attack anyone who is carrying out business within the bazaar. Everyone is under some sort of protection, but this will not stop the more nefarious beings that enter the bazaar from killing a person or two and leaving their corpses hidden. So the player characters will still be in danger. The bazaar is quite colorful, and they will undoubtedly enjoy the different sights and sounds, interactions with the people living there, other vampires and humans. You could get some clues, some information, but you also have to protect the bazaar if needed. There will be a siren attack. You'll have to team up with other factions if that is your choice. You could be rewarded for it, and you could establish some positive relationships with other factions and other non-player characters. But even after you are done carrying out your business within the bazaar, because you can visit all sorts of emporiums and stores and get some resources for your village, you also have the wonders of the bazaar. You could play, for example, at the carnival, like solving artifact puzzles. There's a storytelling contest. There's also an event that is the Make the Strong Man Wins, and you could win some prizes, some very useful prizes, in fact, not only for the sustenance of your village or the survival of your village, but also some things to use during your adventures and explorations. And I think that it's very easy for the game master to come up with some original games to keep things fresh, while offering some powerful artifacts as prizes. But of course, those contests should be adequately difficult to overcome. There's also an arena for those characters that want to test their fighting capacity, and there's also a restaurant, and depending on what you eat, you could also get some bonuses for your next adventure. So I really love this scenario because you have so many potential subplots depending on who you talk to, who you interact with within the bazaar. But also this is a recurring secondary adventure hub for your player characters to visit. But like I said at the beginning of this section, they have to choose if they want to spend their time in leveling up or taking care of their village, or if they want to go into the bazaar and see if they obtain information, some clues, some prizes, something that could be useful in the long run, some resources, etc. The next scenario, Upon Steeds of Iron, introduces the Radiant Cavalry as a major threat. This scenario basically features an area that is covered almost entirely by the curse. You may remember from the core rulebook that the curse is a very tangible thing in the Dawnline. This is not some sort of bad vibe or bad luck that the characters experience. This is a sort of miasma that is deadly to humans, but it's also very dangerous for vampires. They can move within the curse, but not for long, and it's quite risky to do so. So in this scenario, the Radiant Cavalry have taken control of these artifacts, this sort of beacon posts of sorts that can keep the curse at bay. And they will only let the player characters with their wagons through that place if they submit themselves as slaves. So you have to become a slave to the Radiant Cavalry if you want to move through this area without being affected by the curse, because the Radiant Cavalry are very fast due to their vehicles. They can easily turn off or shut down one of these artifact posts, and so the curse will immediately flood an entire area, making it impossible to move through. So it's very easy for them to get the upper hand or have an edge over the player characters and their village by controlling these artifact posts. So it's all up to the player characters to handle some hit and run type of tactics, to move about stealthily if needed. It's all about choosing where you want to go to strike the Radiant Cavalry where it hurts the most. There are actually some members within the Radiant Cavalry that are open to negotiation. After paying a price, they can actually turn a blind eye for the player characters. However, you have to consider if the price that you are going to pay is going to affect you too much, too negatively in the next encounter. For example, a vampire of the Radiant Cavalry, she's going to charge you blood so that she won't attack you or present resistance when you are moving about an area with a post. So you have to keep that in mind if it's worth it to start the next encounter with some blood loss. But although this scenario is quite on the offense side of things, that is, the player characters are attacking, trying to wrestle control from the Radiant Cavalry, taking control of these artifact posts, there are also opportunities to gain valuable resources for your village, and you could even take control of some of the vehicles of the Radiant Cavalry. So you want this sort of artifact steed of sorts, you can do it. You could get your own artifact steed, and I think this is really awesome. After that, we have the scenario Since Yesterday. Since Yesterday is somewhat of a nostalgic scenario in the sense that one or more of the player characters need to have been through this site before. There is this sort of bunker slash ancient lab where humans were carrying out experiments, and a strange entity resulted from this research. This being is obsessed with being more material, more tangible. It doesn't consider itself real. It is quite insane. It is a sort of intelligence. And this strange entity actually caused the demise of all of the people within this bunker laboratory of sorts. But the player characters, if they are old vampires, they also participated in the demise of this site, because it tells of a dark time during their career as guardians where their villages were low on resources. So they needed to go into this place and attack the people within to take their resources. So the player characters were the bad guys back then, but it all depends, because the people carrying out experiments here were also quite irresponsible in the things that they created. So this situation could be seen as a sort of gray area of sorts. Regardless, the entity remembers the player characters, and this entity has a very strong sort of psychic pull. And this intelligence will call the player characters into this site, which is obviously a trap, because in its insanity, this entity, this thing, thinks that it can become more real if it kills all sorts of creatures. So it has a sort of demented Pinocchio type of mentality. The encounters that the player characters will experience within this bunker laboratory, it reminds me of those movies and games that have some sort of artificial intelligence gone rogue, or some demonic sentience running things such as Event Horizon or System Shock. So drawn in to this site because of the psychic pull of the thing, will get the characters into many situations in which they will see things that happened in the past. Those vampires that first attacked this site Because vampires have a very poor memory after living centuries, perhaps even thousands of years, they may have actually forgotten that they attacked this place once. So as the player characters move through the different rooms and corridors, they will experience all sorts of hauntings and grievings and memories from the past, from what happened, from the demise of the people that used to live here. Especially the vampire that actually attacked this place first, or the group of vampires, they will experience these things. Everything will start to come back to them. And this is very cool due to the fact that the vampires suffer this sort of amnesia or mind blank because of their ancient age. It's the player characters and the players themselves experiencing this for what seems to be the first time. And what sorts of dangers and problems can the characters encounter within this place? Well, they could run into hedge-born widowers, they could be attacked by hunting lisks. Even though this place has been abandoned, it is just so on the surface. Many ravenous creatures have taken residence here, and depending on how the characters handle the different encounters, they could start the next encounter badly wounded or unnerved in different ways. There are also dangerous growths and traps, all sorts of flora that is actually quite toxic, and the characters could actually start the next encounter poisoned. They could also run into different constructs, simulacra. There is a very strong sense of horror, palpable sense of horror when compared to the other adventures. The tension builds up, not quickly but constantly, and the characters will start to think and try to figure out what is going on in this place, who caused the deaths of so many people inside, what is the main threat, who is the main antagonist. As this thing, this sort of ethereal entity is manipulating all of the events within this site, or most of the events rather, luckily there are some things that the player characters can take out of this site, some valuable things, some resources for the village, but also ancient knowledge. And I think the hook to get the characters into this site is very well handled. The entity's pool is quite subtle, and it can be played quite easily as some sort of beneficial thing. Maybe the ancient vampire in the group remembers that there is some very valuable thing in this sort of bunker lab, and the player characters never feel forced or tricked into this dangerous area. Also, there is enough background information for the game master to answer all of the player characters' questions during their investigations, and even improvise or come up with the game master's own explanation to why things are happening the way they are. Because as the player characters go deeper into the site, things will become more terrifying, quite creepy. There will be many ghostly dangers. The threat will feel both more ghostly and ghastly. They will also be attacked by sirens, by shamblers, as they move through the different mortuaries and basements. By the end of the adventure, due to the horrifying sights and sounds and memories and grievances that the player characters will witness, not to mention the supernatural threats, especially in the deepest part, this has the potential to become the most horrifying adventure for the Dawnline yet. Now, the last scenario included in this book, which is called A Cup of Salt, has to do with an ongoing relationship between the player character's village and another village by the name of Bitter Limbs. It will start out as a sort of neighborly encounter. Bitter Limbs is going to ask the player characters for help, and it is from then on where the relationship between the two villages will range between hostile, wary, neutral, friendly, and allied. It all depends on who is helping who, and frequent opportunities for courtesies. For example, maybe both caravans are moving through a very narrow spot. Who is going to go first and what attitudes they took to that. Maybe the player characters decided that Bitter Limbs is a bit more at danger or at risk, and they decide to let them go first while exposing themselves to danger. So it's all about trying to find a balance between what your village needs and what Bitter Limbs needs. Because sometimes you could have mutual enemies and it's a better idea to band together. But it's also possible, for example, if the Radiant Cavalry decide to attack Bitter Limbs, you could side with the Radiant Cavalry instead. But from then on, Bitter Limbs is going to become an enemy. So make sure you destroy them if that's the case. But you could also act as an ally for Bitter Limbs and stand against the different hazards and enemies of the wasteland, such as the Radiant Cavalry, fending off Ambassador Wasps, handling Wayfarer Dread Cluster's encounters, and having opportunities to negotiate and strengthen the bonds between the two villages. So throughout your entire campaign, bitter limbs could be like your neighbors, your friends and allies, and you could talk to them, you could send some guardians to have some diplomatic relationships, strengthen those relationships between the villages. And if there is a greater threat in the campaign, I think attacking bitter limbs could cause a sense of dread, of worry for the player characters. If they like the villagers and the guardians of bitter limbs, they could perhaps rush to their rescue. And if they do not get there in time, they could actually feel the agony of seeing bitter limbs completely destroyed. And I also think that, for example, if the player characters and their village get into major problems, bitter limbs could come to their rescue. So this is a great tool for the game master to either present challenges or support the player characters in their campaign. So this is truly a great scenario to handle as a subplot in any campaign. So what do I think of the Dawnline Feral States? I actually think this is a must-have due to the Cruciary, that is the bestiary, and the creature generating system. You're going to have an endless supply of monsters for your entire Dawnline career. The core rulebook already contained enough information for you to come up with your own creatures, but the creature process presented here is so well laid out that I think it's worth it, and the creatures, the beasts, the monsters presented in the Cruciary offer all sorts of adventure seeds. An entire adventure or even an entire campaign could feature one or more of these monsters. When it comes to fiction, it's also great to establish more flavor, more background information concerning the Dawnline. The scenario folio is also excellent due to the variety of ways in which the characters can handle all of the encounters. Some missions favor more diplomacy, some others combat, some others exploration and investigation. And I like it how the Grand Bazaar serves as a secondary adventure hub. I also like it how, for example, the Cup of Salt becomes this recurring theme or subplot throughout an entire campaign and provides steady allies or constant enemies depending on how the negotiations between your village and bitter limbs are handled. I think the other adventures or scenarios highlight different aspects of the Dawnline. Since yesterday is going to truly showcase the horror of the setting, upon Steeds of Iron is very high-paced, lots of action. There are frequent opportunities for stealth ops, types of strategies and tactics, and the Path of Thorns is a very exciting way of starting a campaign or continuing a campaign if you already tackled the first scenario in the core rulebook. It displays the freedom of choice and sandbox nature of the Dawnline immediately. So I highly recommend that you get the Dawnline Feral States. Well, thanks for watching my review. Remember to check out the links in the description below. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.